The agenda this week reflected on the significance of Canada's new king, debated the role of private delivery in public health care, and explored how the opioid crisis is ravaging Northern Ontario. The Agenda's Week in Review begins assessing developments in Russia's war in Ukraine.
Sheldon, why don't you bring the map up? And Angela, maybe you could take us through what you see on this map in terms of the developments that have transpired over the past several days, particularly in the eastern part of Ukraine. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be back on your show. So this was very dramatic in the last few days. The Ukrainians have essentially taken most of the area around Kharkiv, which of course is the second largest city in Ukraine, and they've taken villages and small towns that were part of the kind of logistics and transportation hub for the Russian troops, making it much more difficult for them to project force, to resupply. And what you've had is, at least what we've seen in the images that we have, because journalists are actually not allowed in there, are fleeing Russians. They're leaving all their tanks behind, they're leaving the ammunition behind. And so this really is quite dramatic. And then there is another offensive going on in Kherson, which was a town that was taken very early in the war when Russia invaded. That is going more slowly, but it is also happening. It's also a key logistical place. So I think what we can say is that what used to be, let's say 2 weeks ago, looked like a stalemate, now is much more dynamic. The Ukrainians are on the offensive. They are being more successful than people thought. The Russians are fleeing, or as the Kremlin says, they're just regrouping their forces. But I think we have to wait and see whether the Ukrainians can keep the territory that they've taken, what kind of countermeasures the Russians take, including asymmetric responses. We've already seen them take out much of the power grid in a number of cities around Ukraine until we can say that the Ukrainians have consolidated these gains. But still, it's a very positive sign for the Ukrainians.
Well, those are clearly key questions that you've asked at the end there, which makes me want to ask Jeff Kopstein whether you think this is a genuine turning point in the war.
Well, it depends what we mean by turning point. I mean, they are now 6 months into a 3-day operation, which was supposed to be a blitzkrieg, but it didn't go that way. Then it turned into a war of attrition. So a turning point, the Russians thought the war of attrition would work to their advantage. And this shows that it has not. They appear at this point, at any rate, to be have lost a lot of people, men, have lost, as Angela just said, a lot of materiel. And that's one turning point you could look at. There's yet another turning point, and that is, and Angela also alluded to it, there was a question, and the Ukrainians were under some pressure to do this. Could they actually perform an offensive? And the answer to that, at least preliminarily, appears to be yes. They've gained back some territory. Now, the mother of all turning points would be, is this somehow Putin's Waterloo? And we don't appear to be there yet. I mean, a Waterloo in the sense of Napoleon losing a decisive battle during the Napoleonic Wars, the analogy is apt because Napoleon got so much of his power on the basis of military victory. And Putin himself appeared to have this kind of strongman and undefeatable image. And if he continues to lose at this rate, it can't but hurt him at home. And anybody who's been watching the Russian versions of the agenda, which I've been doing, and I'm sure my co-guests have been doing as well, has seen that things have started to kind of break and change a little bit there in unexpected ways. People like talking heads like us are saying things that they haven't said in a while.
Well, that takes me nicely to Bill Browder, and I want to tap into your knowledge of Russia by asking whether you think, I'm going to ask about a turning point, but in a different kind of way. Is this a turning point in terms of Putin's and/or the Kremlin's ability to spin this back home as an unadulterated success?
Absolutely, it's a turning point. Basically, as everyone else has mentioned, this was supposed to be a 3-day war, in which the Ukrainians were going to welcome Russian troops with open arms and hugs, and it's turned out to be a war where, if you believe the Ukrainian numbers, more than 50,000 Russian troops have been killed. Huge amount of equipment has been destroyed. And now all of a sudden, the Russian military is on the run. It's it's really been a total disaster. And it's really interesting. I guess there's sort of three main audiences for this disaster. One is for the Ukrainian people I mean, this has really improved the morale of the Ukrainian people to see that they could regain this territory. Second, it's very helpful for the Ukrainians asking for help from the United States government and the European Union and everyone else, because the help that we're providing is not being wasted. It's being used very efficiently and very successfully. And then third, and probably most importantly, this is demoralizing for the Russian public, and it's now starting to bubble up above the surface. There, the main talking heads are now discussing who's to blame, and there's starting to become all sorts of little seeds of discontent around Russia, and a lot of people in Russia can tolerate a lot of things, a lot of negative economic repercussions, a lot of dead bodies. But the one thing they can't tolerate is losing. And if Putin is seen to be a loser, they'll take him out in a weekend. And this is, of course, just the beginning of any process that would demonstrate that. But it's something that's so scary that I would imagine Putin is right now kind of coming up with all sorts of retaliations that are going to be very awful and heartbreaking for us to watch going forward, because he can't be seen to be a loser.
What is the crown? The crown is our concept of the state. It's what provides sovereign authority, whether it be the Crown and Council, which is the executive power, the Crown and Parliament, which is the legislative power, or the Crown and the courts, which upholds the king's peace. So even the crown itself, ultimately, even if we were to try to replace it, we would have to replace it with some other concept of the state. Now, when it comes to the person that holds the office of sovereign, or their representatives, whether at the federal level or in the provinces, they have a number of what are called reserve powers. And these are understood to be personal prerogatives that they can exercise to uphold the Constitution or fulfill their duties. Most notably, in the Canadian Constitution, the king is limited to two real powers here. The first is the appointment or dismissal of the Governor General. And as you might recall from Julie Payette's time as Governor General, there was some discussion about whether or not the Queen might have to exercise her personal prerogative to dismiss a Governor General. And the second one is Section 26 of the Constitution Act 1867, which has a dual key system, effectively, for the naming of additional senators, where the Queen or the King and the Governor General need to sign off on that decision. Now, other than that, we're talking about the appointing of first ministers, although there's really not much discretion there left anymore. And the one area where there probably is some discretion, as we saw in BC in 2017, is the ability of vice-regal representatives to decline a request to dissolve the legislatures and to invite a new government to take power. So those are really the limited areas.
Now, I remember from school learning about the powers of reservation and disallowance, meaning that if a governor general or a lieutenant governor thought that a law that had been passed by the House of Commons, approved in the Senate, that they didn't like it, they could refuse to sign it and in effect prevent that law from happening. Are those powers still on the books, number one? And number two, can you imagine any Queen's representative actually using those, or King's representative now, forgive me, using those powers nowadays?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, Steve, because if you look at the federal provision, it refers to the Queen in Council. So the Governor General would reserve or disallow on the advice of the Queen's Council, which at the time in 1867 would have referred to the British Cabinet. So even though it's still in the books, it seems unlikely that the British Cabinet would ask the Governor General to either reserve or disallow a Canadian act or a Canadian bill, as it were. Federally, it gets a little bit more complicated because you might make the argument, and I do know some people who would say, look, the federal government should still have the ability to reserve or disallow provincial legislation, which is deeply offensive to the Constitution. My own view is that it's probably a spent power, and it would be a crisis if that ever occurred. And by the same token, lieutenant governors in the past have seemed to exercise these powers of their own volition, which is highly problematic. And finally, just to end, there has been some talk of whether or not they can deny royal assent, so leaving aside a reservation and disallowance. Can they simply refuse to sign a bill of their own accord? And that, I would argue, is only for the most extreme of circumstances and should never be discussed as a reserve power that would be used lightly.
Understood. Let's, you know what, Sheldon, middle of page 2, let's bring up this graphic here because I would, let's share some polling numbers here. What kind of a task does King Charles III have ahead for him? Because Angus Reid did a survey. This was back in April, mind you. Now, 5 months ago, 51% of Canadians surveyed said the country should not remain a monarchy. The survey found that while 55% of Canadians supported remaining a constitutional monarchy for as long as the Queen is alive, support for Charles and Camilla dropped to 34%. So this is the task at hand, Carolyn, for the new monarch. He needs to, I guess, establish in the public's mind that he can do the job.
Yes, right now there's a big outpouring of sympathy because King Charles III has just lost his mother. He lost his father, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, last year. So we're seeing the cheering crowds outside of Buckingham Palace, expressions of sympathy from around the world. But once he settles into the job, there's going to be a lot of critical scrutiny. And it's a similar moment in some ways to 1901 when Queen Victoria passed away. And many people simply could not imagine her son, Edward VII, who was 59, and that seemed like a great age at that time, stepping into that role. And he managed to exceed expectations and carved out a role for himself as a diplomat on the European stage. And the new King Charles III has emphasized that he wants to be everyone's king, the Commonwealth realms, the nations within the United Kingdom, the overseas territories, people of all faiths, all walks of life. And he's emphasized from day one making himself visible, greeting the crowds immediately, there being cameras there for the Accession Council and his first meeting with British Prime Minister Liz Truss. So we're seeing this very strong emphasis on making the crown, the monarchy, and these royal duties accessible to the public from very early on.
I've watched the healthcare system deteriorate. I've been in this healthcare system now for 4 decades. I've seen successive deterioration. I think there's no question that the pandemic has shone a light on this, showed the deficiencies in the system. But even before that, we were operating in a situation where most public hospitals were at or above capacity, and we simply need to add real capacity to the system in order to keep up and in order to accommodate the growth in population, the aging that we'll see. I think if one of the best solutions in this is to allow more private operations to provide physical facilities and to attract back to the profession a large number of healthcare workers who have left the profession earlier than they planned because of the stresses induced. And now we're finding that even though we have millions of delayed interventions or investigations, we can't keep up with the new problems that we're facing, let alone address that. We need to have additional capacity. The private sector can provide it. We can pay for it out of the public system. You can present your OHIP card showing that you're an insured person. That OHIP card pays the doctor's fee. There was some negotiation that needs to be done around funding the actual operating costs of those facilities, but it can be done, as has been shown in a lot of jurisdictions in the world. And as Mr. Legault, for instance, in the ongoing election campaign in Quebec has promised to build up to 12 privately owned, privately operated facilities.
I'm going to come back to that in a second.
Public.
Okay, let me stop you there because you've put your position on the record very well. Dr. Philpott, let me get you in here and say, if the Ontario government decides that it wants to have more private players providing publicly insured services, what would be your view of that?
So, Steve, you know I'm going to slightly frustrate you here because I
think that we have to have a nuanced response to this question. I think the question itself can be a bit of a distraction, and we need to define some terms first in terms of what we're talking about when we talk about private healthcare, whether it is private delivery of healthcare or private payment of healthcare. And then, of course, even within private delivery, you've got private for-profit and private not-for-profit. So there's a tremendous amount of misunderstanding about what terminology we're using, and I think it's really important to be able to have those conversations. I've told you before, I am not fundamentally opposed to private delivery of healthcare because, of course, I'm a family doctor, and most family doctors in the province, if not and as well as the country, are private practitioners. In fact, they're private for-profit practitioners, but they have obligations to ensure that for medically necessary care, that has to always be publicly funded, and that people can't access care based on private pay for medically necessary services. It has to always be done on the basis of medical needs. So I think that it is unhelpful for us to be ideologically entirely opposed to private delivery of care, or ideologically in favor that that is going to solve all our problems. I think it is neither the whole solution. There are a whole range of other really important solutions, nor is it something that we absolutely shouldn't be open to discussing.
Okay, appreciate your nuanced take on that. And Natalie Mayer, let's go to you and say, same question. Again, if the Ontario government, in its wisdom, decides it wants to have private players provide more publicly funded services, what would be your view of that?
Well, I think we have to be clear that they are actually already doing it, first off. And second off, I think it's pretty clear what we're talking about. The new thing is that the government wants to hand over money to private for-profit clinics that operate sort of as mini hospitals to do surgeries and diagnostics. They announced that, I think, quite clearly in August. And according to the Financial Accountability Office of Ontario, they actually are already doing it in the last quarter of last year. So the period ending April 1st, they doubled the quarterly payments to the private clinics to increase their surgeries and diagnostics. So that is the for-profit privatization of services that were heretofore offered in our local public hospitals. It's quite different than a family doctor who operates in a group or on their own. These are for-profit companies that run these clinics. And I think the other thing that has to be clear is that we have called all of the for-profit clinics. I mean, they have moved in some parts of Canada more than others to take over public hospital services. And each time we've called them, and we've called them multiple times, we've caught the majority of them, not a small minority, but the majority of them violating the Canada Health Act and charging patients outright for surgeries and diagnostics, as well as selling a whole raft of additional add-ons, medically unnecessary services that they charge money for, because that's how they maximize their profits.
So can I just understand, Natalie?
And they bill patients on top. Sorry.
Can I just understand? So your prime objection to going further down this path is the notion that patients will have to pay out of their own pockets in order to avail themselves of these services. Have I got that right?
I think the biggest fear is that we will not be able to preserve single-tier public Medicare in this province or this country if the Ford government continues with its path of privatizing our hospitals.
Can you give us a sense of why opioid deaths are happening at such alarming rates in Northern Ontario?
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize that health disparities are greater in northern communities compared to southern communities. We have greater rates of poverty, homelessness, and as we are seeing with the opioid poisoning crisis, higher rates of substance-related harms. And a very important part of this conversation is the fact that our health outcomes are greatly influenced by social and economic conditions. These are what we call the social determinants of health. They are non-medical factors that influence our health. They include income, education, early childhood development, access to services, to name a few. So when we look to the social determinants of health, we can then begin to understand how issues such as trauma, limited access to services in rural communities, colonialism in the North, and simply stressful life events can then lead someone to substance use initiation, and thus the vicious and dangerous and tragic cycle that we are seeing with the opioid poisoning crisis.
Leanne, Hillary mentioned the social determinants of health. People may be finding ways to cope with their lives because of the things that they have to navigate on a daily basis. It's a tall order to deal with the crisis at hand and also to address poverty, childhood trauma, being unhoused. To what extent is your jurisdiction able to cope with a crisis, let alone to prevent it?
It's an incredibly important question, and exactly what Hillary mentioned is where public health does need to focus our time and energy. We really continue to strive to work and increase priority in the area of prevention, of ensuring that we have safe, connected, healthy communities, that we're supporting the policies and the processes for early childhood development, that we're looking at housing, we're looking at income, that we're looking at trauma-informed care, and all of the items that really we know impact substance use and lead to this tragic outcome that we continue to see. And you're right, it's challenging in the middle of the crisis that we're seeing to make sure that we're putting that time and energy and that we really continue to see the funding and priority in prevention and upstream measures to really address the social determinants of health and the complex factors that really lead to the crisis that we're seeing currently.
Did the pandemic make the situation worse with the opioid crisis?
Definitely. I think we saw that clearly across Ontario. We know that individuals tended to be using alone more often. We know that support systems were broken or sort of, not available as they had been prior to the pandemic. And so we definitely saw that in the numbers and the tragic losses across the province and across our region, and definitely something that we need to continue to focus on the upstream prevention and also ensure that we have the emergency supports in place to save lives while we're working on the comprehensive approach.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find more, including the full conversations, on our website, tvol.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.